Here, deep in these woods, inside this car, are two people in major trouble. One is a woman, a prostitute really, and has just been extremely violated and harmed by the man seated next to her. And now the man is slumped over in his seat, clinging to life. She shot him multiple times in the chest, and now, in the quiet of the night, with nothing but the crickets chirping, this man is a goner. Now some, who are understanding, may say she defended herself against her attacker, right? But the thing is, this attack may or may not have even happened. Perhaps she shot him multiple times simply because she wanted to. We truly don't know. But what we do know is she has robbed his corpse for whatever valuables he may have had and is now on the run. If this now deceased man did in fact harm this woman, then the question is, did he deserve it? And if he did the next 6 men deserve it too? So as they say, this is a man's world. Everything usually goes in their favor, from societal views, laws, and all-around patriarchy. They dominate society, sports and entertainment, and even crimes, especially that of serial killing. But one woman put a major dent in that, striking fear in men from all over the Florida area. Back in 1990, one woman from a skewed background gave these men a run for their money by becoming the first female serial killer, and men were her prey. Aileen Wuornos, born Eileen Carol Pittman, came into this world on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Life for this child would begin with trauma, abuse, neglect, and abandonment, all the ingredients to create the perceived monster that she'd eventually become. She was born the daughter of Diane Wuornos and Leo Dale Pittman, a couple that had a very tumultuous relationship at a very young age. Diane was 14 years old when she became pregnant by the 18-year-old Leo. Diane's parents did not approve of the union, and so the two eloped. She gave birth to a baby boy named Keith, and only months later she gave birth to Aileen. The teen marriage was wrecked with toxicity and abuse. Immediately, troubles began, and Aileen and her brother's life was marred by instability from the beginning. Her father, Leo, was a diagnosed schizophrenic who was convicted of child touching and later committed self-deletion in prison before Aileen ever had the chance to meet him. For a while, Diane tried to raise her children on her own and tried to provide a stable life for them, but eventually gave up and went back to her parents' home. It was there where she dropped off her 2 children and ran away, never to reclaim them. Aileen was just 4 years old at the time. Aileen and her brother were left in the care of their maternal grandparents, Lorrie and Britta Wuornos, in Troy, Michigan. But instead of finding stability, Eileen's life worsened. Her grandmother, Britta, was an alcoholic, and her grandfather, Lorrie, was an abusive disciplinarian. As if the neglect and abuse from the adults wasn't enough, things became, for lack of better words, weird between her and her brother. They developed a very strange and inappropriate relationship with each other. But unfortunately, acts like this wouldn't become rare for Aileen. This type of stuff would happen more and more the older she became. By her early teenage years, Aileen had experienced physical and sexual abuse at the hands of her grandfather and possibly other male figures in her life. This abuse contributed to Eileen's spiraling behavior. By the age of 11, she had begun engaging in acts in exchange for cigarettes, drugs, and food, signaling the early beginnings of a life intertwined with survival X work. By age 14, Aileen was pregnant, allegedly as a result of being R-worded by a friend of her grandfather. She was sent to a home for unwed mothers and later forced to give up the child for adoption, something that greatly hurt her because she wasn't even allowed to see what her baby looked like. This hurt her a lot. After the birth, she was kicked out of her grandparents' home, forced to live in the woods near her hometown. With nowhere else to turn, she became a vagabond drifter, relying solely on prostitution and petty crimes to survive. This would set the stage for the violent path she would later tread. Aileen Wuornos' adult life was a constant battle for survival. After leaving Michigan, she hitchhiked across the country, earning money primarily through prostitution. By the late 1970s, she had several run-ins with the law, with charges ranging from DUI, disorderly conduct, and assault to armed robbery. Known for her explosive temper and hot and cold mood swings, her relationships were chaotic and often abusive. In 1976, Aileen briefly married a 69-year-old wealthy yacht club president, Louis Fell. The marriage was a disaster from the start. Eileen's violent temper soon surfaced, and she was arrested for assaulting Fell with his own cane. Their marriage was annulled within a matter of weeks. In 1986, Aileen met Tyra Moore, a hotel maid, in a Florida bar. The two quickly began a romantic relationship, with Aileen viewing Tyra as the one person she could trust. The relationship was intense and codependent. After all the abuse Aileen endured at the hands of males, it was the love of a woman that she'd feel safe in. And she didn't want anything to get in between that. She was willing to do anything to keep Tyra in her life. The couple lived on the road, traveling between cheap motels and relying on Eileen's earnings from prostitution. They lived the vagabond life and were constantly on the go. Maybe this instability is what caused Aileen to finally go off the deep end to no return, because this was during the period that Eileen's rage and mental instability escalated, leading to the string of murders that would later seal her fate. On the evening of November 30th, 1989, Richard Mallerie, a 51-year-old electronics store owner, made a decision that would seal his fate. He was driving along Interstate 75 when he picked up Aileen, who was hitchhiking along the highway. The two struck up a conversation and, as Aileen later admitted, she agreed to accompany him for a paid sexual encounter. What happened next has been the subject of much debate and remains unclear, as Aileen and Richard were the only two people who truly knew the details of that night. Aileen claimed that once they parked in a remote area in Volusia County, Richard suddenly brutally assaulted and R-worded her. According to her later testimony, the encounter quickly turned violent, with Richard tying her up and threatening her life. Acting in a moment of sheer panic and fear, Aileen pulled out a .22 caliber pistol and shot Richard multiple times. This was Eileen's first kill, and some would even say it was justified, but the question is it even true? Many seem to think so because Aileen seemed to pick the perfect victim or got rid of the perfect villain. According to records, Richard Mallerie had a very dark past of his own. Richard was known to be a quiet loner and stayed to himself a lot. However, behind his quiet exterior, Richard had a troubled past. Court records would later reveal that he had served time in prison for sexual assault, and that his behavior toward women had long been a cause for concern. He was a convicted rapist, and his murder would later become a pivotal point in her trial due to his criminal record, which Aileen claims as justification for the killing. Eventually, the details of her account of the night she killed Richard would change over the years. But in her original story, Richard's death was portrayed as a direct result of his sexual assault and her desperate need to escape. Aileen says she was fighting for her life, but after killing Richard, she stole his car and some of his personal belongings. She drove away, leaving his decomposed body in the woods, where it would remain undiscovered for nearly 2 weeks. It was these actions that made people believe it was more than just self-defense, but instead cold, calculated murder, but he was only the first. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen Wuornos murdered 7 men in Central Florida. Her modus operandi was to lure men, usually truck drivers or other strangers, by posing as a hitchhiker or offering sex for money. Once in the car, Aileen would shoot the men at point-blank range with a .22 caliber pistol before stealing their belongings and often their vehicles. After Richard Mallerie, her next set of victims were Charles Carskadden, a 40-year-old part-time rodeo worker, killed in May 1990. David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker, killed in June 1990. Troy Burris, a 50-year-old sausage salesman, killed in July 1990. Charles Dick Humphreys, 56-year-old retired Air Force major and former chief of police, killed in September 1990. Peter Seams, a 65-year-old retired merchant seaman whose body was never recovered, though his car was found abandoned. Walter Antonio, a 62-year-old trucker, security guard, and reserve police officer, killed in November 1990. Aileen claimed that she killed these men in self-defense, stating that they had either raped or attempted to rape her during the encounters. However, the level of brutality and the evidence collected by investigators painted a different picture, one of cold-blooded robbery and murder. Aileen's downfall began with the murder of her final victim, Walter Antonio, in November 1990. Investigators began linking her to the murders when evidence from her victim's stolen cars and items sold to pawn shops connected her to the scenes. The most damning evidence would happen on July 4th, 1990. Aileen and Tyra were driving around inside victim Peter Seam's car, and in the process, Aileen was speeding around the bend and crashed into a tree. Seeing witnesses appearing, Aileen became belligerent to them, ripped the license plate from the vehicle and threw it in the woods, and both of the ladies fled and abandoned the car. Rhonda Bailey, who witnessed the accident, was able to provide the police with a description of two women, which later led to a media campaign to find them. Now Aileen was already under investigative eyes, but now Tyra was too. Because her fingerprints were also found and identified on victim Peter Seams's vehicle, she was a suspect as well. This greatly upset her because she knew she had nothing to do with the murders and didn't want to be a part of this. But she was also very much afraid of Aileen and what she'd possibly do to her if she tried to leave. Either way, both their faces were out there, and the police closed in as they launched an undercover operation. Eventually, Tyra did leave Aileen and went to stay with her sister in Pennsylvania, leaving Aileen to fend for herself. The whole state of Florida was scared and on a manhunt for these two women. People were puzzled because they couldn't believe that a woman could be capable of doing so-called man crimes like serial killing. It took a while, but soon they met their match. Ironically, on January 9th, 1991, Aileen was arrested at a biker bar called The Last Resort in Volusia County, Florida. The arrest came after the police gathered enough evidence from the pawn shop receipts and witness statements to charge her with multiple counts of murder. However, the case took a dramatic turn when Tyra, fearing she might be implicated in the crimes as well, cooperated with the police. She agreed to wear a wire and, over the course of several phone conversations, convinced Aileen to confess to the murders. It seems Aileen may have known Tyra was trying to set her up, because on the phone calls she became very suspicious of her.
Ty?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Nothing. What the hell are you doing?
Nothing. I'm sitting here in jail.
Yeah, it's what I heard.
Listen, I gotta ask you something. Is there anybody in that room?
No, just me.
What?
What?
Is there anybody in your room?
No.
Aileen loved Tyra very much and didn't want her involved, so she told her to do what she needed to do.
I don't know whether I should keep on living or if I should...
No, Ty, listen.
What?
You go ahead and let them know what you need to know. If you want to know or anything, you're innocent. Listen, if I have to confess, I will.
On January 16th, 1991, Aileen Wuornos confessed to the killings, but maintained that all the murders were committed in self-defense. Her trial for the murder of Richard Mallerie began in January 1992. Prosecutors portrayed Aileen as a predatory prostitute who killed for financial gain. The defense, however, attempted to paint her as a mentally ill woman who had endured a lifetime of abuse and violence. The prosecution's strongest evidence came from Aileen's taped confession and the testimony of Tyra, who testified against her in exchange for immunity. On January 27, 1992, Aileen was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Richard Mallerie. The jury recommended the death penalty, and Aileen was sentenced to death. Over the next few years, she would be convicted of 5 more murders and receive additional death sentences, though she would ultimately be executed for only 6 of the murders. She pled no contest to several of the other charges, hoping to spare her victims' families the pain of additional trials. Throughout her time in prison, Eileen's mental state deteriorated. Psychologists who evaluated her noted severe borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. She exhibited signs of paranoia, delusions, and psychosis, often ranting about conspiracies and accusing prison staff of torturing her. In 2001, after nearly a decade on death row, Aileen declared she no longer wanted to pursue further appeals, stating she was ready to die. She believed the prison was tormenting her and that she had experienced enough suffering. Eileen's mental state was evaluated before her execution to ensure she was competent to make the decision to end her appeals. Despite concerns about her sanity, the courts ruled she was fit for execution. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Her last words were chilling and bizarre, reflecting her deep paranoia and detachment from reality. I'd just like to say, I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back. Aileen was only 46 years old at the time of her death. Aileen Wuornos' life and crimes have left a lasting impact on American society. Her case raised numerous questions about the intersection of mental illness, trauma, and violence. Was Aileen a cold-blooded killer, or was she a damaged and abused woman who snapped under the weight of a lifetime of suffering? While she remains infamous for her brutal murders, her story is also a tragic reflection of the failures of the system to address the deep scars of childhood trauma and abuse. Her life and crimes have been the subject of countless books, documentaries, and films, most notably the 2003 film Monster, in which Charlize Theron portrayed Aileen, winning an Academy Award for her performance. Through these portrayals, the world continues to grapple with the complexities of Aileen Wuornos, a woman who lived the saying, hurt people, hurt people. So, lurkers, what do you think? Do you think Aileen actually killed those men for their belongings? Or do you think they actually did harm her? Was it all self-defense? Let me know down below.